Hi, I'm Leonard and welcome back to another Substance tour. Today we're going to take a look at how I created Moss Substance 1 for CC0 textures. You can see it right here. Now, as always, this is not a step-by-step tutorial that will show you every single button to press and every single value that you have to adjust, because I think those are really boring. I always think Substance tutorials are extremely bland, even more bland than, let's say, a Blender tutorial. So instead, this is more of an overview or a conceptual explanation of the steps that I took to get this really fine pattern and this overall shape. Alright, so let's jump in. Here we have the entire graph. As you can see, it is sort of grouped up into different areas. I didn't use frames for this one because I think it's not that big, but you can see there are sort of different sections to it. So there's this, which creates the individual elements of the moss. Then up here we have something that involves color. This is where the color is actually created. And then down here it all sort of fades down into less and less individual nodes, which ultimately creates the output. So this is where it all gets blended together. So let's begin with the individual shapes. These are the tiny individual plants or individual strands that you can see in the final moss texture. And normally what you would do with something like that is, I actually have the reference here. If you look at other people's substance graphs, which I like to do, you can see that they always take these shapes, basic shapes like a paraboloid, and then sort of fade it down into an individual strand like this, and then this individual strand gets warped in all kinds of ways. You can see these like dark greenish nodes are always warp nodes, and then after a lot of additional transformation they all get blended together into this circular shape. Now if you're making something with larger plants, that might be a good idea because you need to have a lot of fine control over how these strands look and everything. But in my case, I'm not doing that. I'm just creating moss, which has literally hundreds of thousands of these strands. So I've decided to take a slightly different route to save some time, and that is to make a very creative use of the scratches generator. Now I think many people don't realize this, but it actually has a setting, if I can find it, which is called spline position random. Normally, by default, this is set to 1. And 99% of the time this is actually what you want, because you take a surface and you want to place random scratches all across it. But what you can actually do is, you can use the right slider. Where is it? There. You can turn it down to 0, and this will mean that all the individual splines will be placed in the center. And if you then take the random rotation, like this, you can already get something that kind of looks like a plant, a little bit. At this point you might still need some imagination to see that, but we'll get to it. So what I've done is I've created 6 copies of this, each with slightly different settings. For example, for the second one, I changed this to fade mode, just end instead of start and end. You can see the difference. This is start and end, and this is end, so we can see we have this really hard drop off here. And for other things, I, for example, increased the number of total splines to 256. I think it's 64 in the other ones. I introduced a bit of random position, like 0.25, so it's still grouped in the center, but it's a little bit random. And yeah, I created a total of 6 different variations. Now the 6th one is special because I didn't want to just rely on these strands, because maybe I can find a good image of that. If you take moss, you can see that there are also, this is a very blurry image. Let's see if I can find a better one. Maybe here. Yeah, you can maybe see that there are also very small other shapes in this. In this case, I decided to create sort of a clover leaf, or just a generic flower-like thing to place in there. So for that, I just started out with a paraboloid, and I took a transformation node. I basically did the thing that I just explained, because this time it's actually necessary. This time I can't cheat my way through with a scratch generator. So I took that, I squished it down on the x-axis, and then I used a Cartesian to polar grayscale node. And what this does is it takes in the image like this, and it sort of wraps it around a circle. So you can imagine this is the top part, and this is the inner part. And so this gradient, this shape gets wrapped around the circle like that. And this already gives you a shape that loosely resembles a flower. So then all I had to do is add in this center element, sort of warp it a little bit to get some randomness. And then, just because I already had the shape from the scratch generator, I decided to multiply that to give it a bit more randomness. Yeah. I also blurred all of these shapes. You can see that, because by default the scratch generator is not really built to have these really thick splines like that. You can see I've set it to 50, which is really high. I think by default it's on 1 or 2. So we're sort of working with the limits of this node, and it shows, because it creates these large gaps in the individual strands, in the individual splines. And so I just used the blur to get rid of those. So in the end we have 6 shapes. Let's just go through them one by one. Here they are. And now these 6 shapes need to somehow get on this surface. Now for that I'm using a shape splatter node. I'm going to show you the auto-leveled version, because this is 32 bits and it's actually above 1. So it has a lot of displacement, and so I sort of pushed it down with an auto-level node. Okay, so if we look at that, you can see it's already immediately starting to resemble moss, like this. Now there is a little bit of randomness. You can see there are already like slightly darker parts. That's because I just took 2 clouds nodes and just put them in the shape and scale, just to get a little bit of randomness. Not much. It's just set to a strength of 0.3, I think. Yeah, the scale map multiplier is set to 0.3, so there's just a little bit of randomness. We'll introduce much more randomness later. Yeah, and this is sort of the base on which the second layer of moss will be added. So after that there's actually a second shape splatter node. It's really just a copy, with one important difference. And that is that the x amount and the y amount is multiplied by 80%. So the first shape splatter just takes in the scale value that you set, and the second one also takes it in, but multiplies it by just 80%. So there are overall less patterns to be placed, and this means that the individual patterns will be bigger. I think I also also bumped up the scale a lot. And the effect that this creates is that there's sort of a foreground and a background now. So you can see in the foreground we have a lot of large shapes, and then occasionally you can sort of peek through and see the background that's still there from the first shape splatter node. And this also makes sure that there are barely any black parts. Now in here you can see there are just a lot of areas that weren't originally covered by this shape splatter node, and this second iteration, if you want to say it like that, it takes care of that. And so now we have again one uniform shape. This one's actually even more uniform because I'm not even using the randomness. I'm just using the randomness that sort of comes through via the background height into the second shape splatter node. Now at this point it's probably a good idea to talk about color, because up here I have two shape splatter blend color nodes. I hate that name, and I'm just going to call them color nodes from now on. And these two color nodes, they take in the 6 different patterns. I just blended them with the 2 colors. So these first 3 go together up here with this color, just like this light green, and then I take this slightly darker green and blend it together with these 3 shapes, and then all 6 of them go into this color node, which introduces a bit of randomness on the saturation part, and it also has this gradient map, this gradient input, which is really just a cloud texture put across a gradient map. And what it does is it has a really interesting effect, because now you might say I could just use a blend node, like place them randomly and with a little bit of random color, and then just take a blend node. I could even do it. Just take a blend node, put this on top, and then set it to either copy, yeah, like that, or maybe set it to multiply. But this does not quite have the same effect, because what this will actually do is it's going to take an individual pixel. So let's say it wants to place a shape right there on this pixel, because it has received the information from the original shape splatter node that an object, or a pattern as it calls it, should be placed there. So it wants to place it on this pixel, and it needs to work out the random color for this. So it takes in the color from here, from the color inputs, it then randomizes it a little bit, and then it doesn't just blend it with this pixel and all the pixels around it from the gradient map, but instead it uses just this one pixel and it applies this color to the entire shape, to the entire pattern. And this means that there isn't one overall gradient across the entire image, but instead every small plant has its own unique color. And now for moss, I probably could have gotten away with it with just using a blend node, but for larger shapes, if you have less shapes, smaller tiling size, then this is, I think, is the better approach, because it means that there isn't just this random gradient that you can quickly work out, or that you can quickly detect as a viewer looking at the texture. And instead it looks more natural, because the individual plants maintain their texture. I can maybe even show this off if I just take one of those, one of the parts from the gradient map, and just make it like orange. Here you can see it. So if we want to simulate, for example, dead elements in the moss, then this looks much better than just having like this brown patch, this brown part on top of it. Instead, we really have individual plants in the moss that appear to be dead, or to be dying, or just to be dehydrated. I don't know how moss looks if it's dead. So this is the better approach in my opinion. Yeah, I'm again applying this 2 times, using the first one as the background for the second one. And at this point we basically have the essential moss texture done. You can see it right here. This is the displacement and this is the color. But if you look at the displacement and compare that to the finished 3D view, you can see this is still extremely uniform. Now, there are situations where you might want that, but in reality, moss often grows in these patches. You can see it really strong in this image because it's on a tree bark and it can't just grow freely. And you can see there are these individual patches, these individual, I call them bumps in the moss. You can also see it here. It goes up and then there's sort of a depression in it, and then it goes back up and there's another depression, and so on and so on. And I decided to recreate that effect just using a cells 1 node like this. Again, I blurred it out a little bit because by default the cells 1 introduces these really sharp corners in the dark parts, in the crevices. So I just applied a little bit of blur, 0.25, to get rid of that. And that's going to be the texture to simulate the bumps in the moss. So I then just blend the two together, and you can see the blending effect is actually really quite strong. So the opacity is controlled by an expression, and you can see it takes the bumps strength node, so that's a slider in the substance player. It takes that and just multiplies it by 0.8. I didn't want it to go all the way to 1. So if you put in 1 as a bump strength, then you'll actually get the value of 0.8 applied to this node. And this means that you can get really strong bumps, but it cannot completely overshadow it. But 0.8 is still quite high, and you can see that if you sort of approach it at an angle, most of the displacement is actually coming from just this cells texture. So if you set it to a strong setting, then this really complicated displacement map only makes up 20% of the moss. But together with the color and the normal map, especially the normal map, this is still the dominant pattern that you will see in the end. But at the same time, you can have these little bumps and these dark spots, we'll get on those later, in the final material, which just helps break it up a little bit, essentially. So now we have the displacement, which is essentially done at this point. We still have to apply a few tweaks to the color, because again, this is still not completely bland, not completely uniform. We already talked about these steps around the gradient map and the random color, but it's still not that unique. So let's really zoom in and take a look at the next step. And what this does is it takes a cross section of the final height map, and it makes just this part brighter. So you can see the top spots up here, which all sort of shared the same color, are now getting a little bit brighter, whereas the bottom spots, which are lower down, they still maintain their original darker color, and this just helps increase the variety on the material. And then in the next step, I take in another really subtle gradient map and just blend it in on the darkest spots, because otherwise these would show up, or these might show up as black, and I don't want that. So again, I'm using the output from the height blend node down here, and I'm just mixing this in. But you can see this is barely having an effect. It also kind of depends on your settings. On the current default settings, this does not really do a lot. Yeah, so we have a color, we have a roughness, which is basically just the curvature. Whenever I don't know what to do for roughness, I just take the curvature and it works out almost always. So the curvature goes through a levels node which has its midpoint connected up to the roughness. I've inverted the roughness so that if the roughness is set to 0, then the midpoint goes up to 1 and vice versa, because otherwise the roughness would be inverted and that would be a bit weird for the end user. And then all of this, the color, the roughness, and the height from over here, it all goes ironically into a moss weathering node. It's maybe a bit strange to apply a moss effect to moss, but it actually gives us an effect that we really want. So if we compare, this is the before and this is the after. So let's zoom on one area where it's really strong, where it's clearly visible, like that. And what the moss node essentially does is, if we again go back to a reference image, which one is good for that? Let's take this one. If we take in the moss, you can see there are these spots that are really low down, and in a scenario like this, water will collect there, and this will make the material darker and more reflective. So you can see the moss weathering node is already taking care of the color aspect, so you can see a noticeable darkening in everything which has a low displacement. So for reference, this is the displacement. You can see it's really dark, and the moss weathering ensures that this also gets a little bit darker. Now for the roughness, if we make the comparison, you can see that also the roughness gets a little bit darker, so it gets a bit more reflective. This is sort of to represent the humidity that might collect inside the moss, which sort of becomes visible in these small depressions, in these small creases. Yeah, so as an output we have a color, we have a roughness, and we have a height, which we can use to generate all the other maps. The height just goes into an ambient occlusion map. I really had to turn down the settings for this one because the structure itself is so intricate, which means that on the default settings this would have been just completely white on these areas and then just completely black on the crevices. So I really turned that down, and now you can see it really helps accentuate the individual strands. You can make out every little detail in here. Yeah, the normal map you can see is quite strong, because in reality moss has so many tiny details that even if the roughness is fairly low, which this isn't because this is not completely wet, but even in these areas where the roughness is fairly low, you can see that we still have a lot of detail, and so they still appear fairly rough and only a little bit wet. You can see it here if we really turn the light. They only appear a little bit wet, but they still maintain a lot of detail in the final render. So that's why I really pumped up the normal map for this material. And just for completeness sake, we've already seen the finished color map. Let's just again zoom in. You can see the dark spots, you can see the individual colorings which are handed out on a per plant basis, so that it's not just a gradient. You can see how the top part has become brighter than the medium parts or the bottom parts. And yeah, that concludes the moss material. I think I'm going to use this for a lot of other substances, for example paving stones or bricks. This is a material that you can almost always throw in to add a bit of detail to another surface, to add like a degraded effect, to make something look old basically. Yeah, I hope this was an interesting guide. Again, it's not a full tutorial because there are a lot of values that I tweaked, and Substance is always about experimenting with the sliders, so I think having full tutorials for that is always a bit bland or boring. Nonetheless, if you want to play around with this, I'm going to upload this to the Google Drive folder for all patrons. Yeah, so you can try that out for yourself, and I'll see you in another video.